This is also going to be an interactive session, so I'm going to ask Dr. Matt Camp to come up.
Thanks, Janice. Welcome, everyone. We will be starting in a few minutes. In the meantime, please take a look at your program and the postcard. On the one-pager that we handed out, you've got the League of Women Voters of New York City has a Get Out the Vote postcard. These are instructions. And then the postcard, I think everyone should have one, is self-addressed. It's addressed to a voter in a low turnout district in New York City. It's already stamped, so we save you the time and the money of doing that. Now, if you could fill out a little note to encourage that voter to show up for Election Day. We have advice on how to do this. Has to be nonpartisan, and it could say something like, "See you at the polls, join us at Election Day." There's other great suggestions. Thank you, co-chair Kai Rosenthal, for providing all of this for us. So that's a great way to take action this very moment. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Although we had 60 folk who signed up in person, we have a bunch of folk who are joining us online. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's Section 1. Section 2. The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. That's our 15th Amendment. And it is what has expanded our democracy, and it is what folk are challenging now in terms of our democracy. Welcome. I'm Janice Robinson, Vice President for Diversity and Community Affairs and Associate Professor of Higher Education. And we have a wonderful and special program and panel today. And it's TC Votes, Voting Rights, What You Need to Know. But this extraordinary panel are, and I'm going to introduce them, are individuals who are engaged in the actual litigation and work of ensuring our right to vote and ensuring our democracy. And I am thrilled that they are here before Election Day, that they took time to be here with us. Our program is co-sponsored with Dr. Matt Camp's office, the Office of Government Relations and Community Engagement. I'm going to make my welcome remarks short so that we can spend as much time with our panelists. And let me quickly introduce them. Julie Ebenstein, raise your hand, very good. She is a senior staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union Voting Rights Project. Since 2013, she has litigated voting rights matters across the country, including challenges to felony disenfranchisement in Florida and Iowa, discriminatory voter suppression laws in North Carolina, at-large school board elections in Ferguson, Missouri, dual voter registration systems in Kansas, and election officials' rejection of absentee ballots based on voter signatures in California and New Hampshire. Leading up to the 2012 general election, Julie was a staff attorney with the ACLU of Florida and counsel in several voting rights cases. Before joining the ACLU, Julie focused on refugee protection issues, working first with the International Rescue Committee on the Thailand-Myanmar border, and then with Lawyers for Human Rights in South Africa. Julie is a graduate of Columbia University and Fordham University School of Law. She's admitted to practice in New York and Florida. Who's next? We have Susana Lorenzo-Giguere. She's Associate Director of Democracy Program with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF, as we always say, which I've been a member. Susana worked for more than 20 years at the U.S. Department of Justice, including 11 years in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. Susana has litigated cases to enforce the minority language provisions of the Voting Rights Act, conducted Section 5 administrative reviews on bilingual ballots and redistricting, and managed federal election coverage of state and local elections. Susana has also enforced the Americans with Disability Act through her work in the Disabilities Rights section of the Civil Rights Division. Before going to the DOJ, she was a pro se law clerk in the Southern District of New York. We have Jose Luis Perez, who Deputy General Counsel, LatinoJustice, PRLDEF. Jose Perez, boy, you have a long bio, so I'm going to just hit all the wonderful highlights. Jose Perez served as LatinoJustice PRLDEF's legal director from 2007 to 2021, and was the lead lawyer in several precedent-setting immigrant rights cases. The first establishing fair housing eviction protections for undocumented rent regulation tenants in New York City. Second, barring private landlords from ascertaining immigration status of prospective tenants. Third, barring the local law enforcement from enforcing administrative immigration warrants. And of the Cesar Vargas New York Bar admissions case, establishing that the court character and fitness committee can determine a declamated law graduate's bar admissions eligibility without any prior enabling the state for legislation authorizing such professional licensing. The point is that he has been deeply engaged through the years. Jose has mentored countless college and law students of color through the past 3 decades. Currently, he of course is a graduate of St. John's Law School, 1985. We just missed each other. I graduated in 83. And he began his legal career with the Queens County District Attorney's Office. So and who am I missing? Christina, and Christina Das. All right. She's an attorney in the Prepare to Vote and Voting Rights Defender Project at LDF, where she leads election protection efforts in Texas and South Carolina and supports LDF's overall voting rights litigation efforts. Christina works across coalitions to execute state-based campaigns for electoral reform legislation to ensure access to the ballot for marginalized communities, restoration of voting rights for those with felony convictions, and jail-based voting for pretrial detainees. She joined LDF after graduating from the City University of New York School of Law in 2020, where she served as a managing editor of the Law Review and a teaching assistant for the Civil Rights Trial Clinic. She began working on voting rights matters as a campus organizing fellow at the University of Pittsburgh's Honors College during the 2012 presidential election. She has since facilitated nonpartisan election protection efforts on the ground in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Mississippi. She was recently appointed to the New York State Bar Association's task force on voting rights and democracy. So we are thrilled that you're here, and we are eager to hear from you. The way this will work is they will talk for about 7 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up. All right, Julie. Is that on?
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you all for having me. Thank you for attending tonight. This is a lovely location for this conversation, and it is exactly the right time for us to have it. I'm going to give my name's Julie Ebenstein. I'm with the ACLU Voting Rights Project. We are primarily litigation focused, and we challenge suppressive or discriminatory voting related and election related laws across the country. I'm just going to take a few minutes to give some background on the way that people are kept out of the democratic process in the US before we talk about some more specifics. I think it's clear to many people that we have a participation problem in this country. That is chalked up by some to individual decisions or individual apathy, but it is not at its core really about individual decisions. There are structural barriers to people being able to participate effectively, and participate equally. So I just wanted to cover three things. One is who do we keep out of the democratic process through ineligibility? And there I'll talk about felony disenfranchisement. Who do we prevent from participating even if they are eligible? Talk about some of the barriers to voting and voter suppression tactics. And then whose voting power do we dilute? Right now, redistricting is a topic that we're working on very heavily. How do we devalue or diminish certain groups and communities' voices even when they get to the polls and cast their ballot? Felony disenfranchisement is something that I care about and have worked on a lot. I think it is a slow burn issue that is always present, and so sometimes it doesn't get the same attention that it should. But there are over 5 million people in the US disenfranchised because of a conviction. Some people might be surprised to learn that we're not only talking about people in prison or even folks who are serving probation or parole or still serving their sentence at all. In some instances, we're talking about people who have completed all the terms of their sentence and are back in their community, participating members who have value to contribute to the political process and who benefit from participating in lower recidivism rates and otherwise a larger voice in the community. So there's a case that we worked on recently in Florida where voters of Florida voted to re-include people with a prior conviction in the democratic process. It used to be they were locked out of the process for life. Florida voters decided that they should be reintegrated and restore their right to vote after they completed their sentence. The Florida legislature decided that completion of sentence included payment of all outstanding legal financial obligations. So the fees that are tacked on when somebody is convicted, the Florida legislature decided that people have to pay their fees before they can vote. It was a pay to vote scheme, which is antithetical to our democratic process. So there is just one example of over 1 million people in a single state who the state legislators have decided to lock out of the democratic process. And like I said, there's 5 million people who fit into that category, folks who states have decided they want to keep out of the process entirely. That's one issue that we try to address both through the courts and through advocacy efforts. A second are the informal barriers to participation. So somebody is perfectly eligible, they're registered, what prevents them from voting? It is usually not a lack of effort on their side. There are other factors. Something that got attention a while back was voter ID laws. If somebody doesn't have an up-to-date picture ID with their appropriate address, and their same first and last name as, let's say, on their license, in some states, they would be unable to cast a regular ballot. That can be a huge deterrent to people who don't have documentation or just simply don't have it with them at the polls and can't make a trip back and forth. We challenged the signature match requirement on vote by mail ballots. People are more familiar with voting by mail now. A few years into the pandemic, I had a client in New Hampshire who was 92 years old and legally blind, who could not sign the same way twice, but felt strongly that she wanted to be the one to sign her ballot. So they would match her registration signature from 30 years ago to her signature on her vote by mail ballot, and her ballot was being thrown out since they said, oh, well, these signatures don't map. There are small details like that that can really have a butterfly effect in keeping people out of the process. And just to continue with the overview before my colleagues get into more specific details, right now we're in a redistricting cycle, and that will have repercussions for at least the next decade. We are challenging, I believe we're now up to 9 different states where we're challenging either the state legislative maps or the congressional maps. And those are structural ways in which voters' votes are diluted. We have a case that we're working with LDF in Alabama, using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to show that the congressional lines themselves are racially discriminatory. They were drawn in a way where the 27% of the voting age population in Alabama who's Black could never elect their candidate of choice, except for in one of 7 districts. So you have lines drawn to keep people out of the process by preventing them from electing their candidates of choice. Political gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering is another issue that we take on with cases right now in Ohio, to show that when you have a partisan legislator drawing the lines to decide how voting districts are formulated, they can be drawn in a way that advantages one party or another, and that is not the principle behind our democratic process. So these are just general topics to keep in mind as we talk through participation in this election and voting rights. Who do we decide to keep out of the election, of the democratic process? Who do we decide to prevent or make it difficult for people to vote? And once people do participate, how do we structurally dilute their vote so that their voice does not have the same strength and the same weight as other people's voices? I look forward to hearing questions from this group after my colleagues start with their remarks. Thank you.
Can you hear me? All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. Thank you to the Teachers College and Juan and Janelle, Matt, and everybody for helping to coordinate. I really appreciate it. Such a pertinent and timely panel. We are, nearly 11 days till Election Day, and so many states have already started early voting, right? So I'm really excited to be in such an esteemed panel with my colleagues and folks that I look up to. As you know, they have so much more experience than me, so I'm really excited to be in this space with them. So I manage election protection for LDF in Texas and South Carolina. So I want to talk about the election protection work and also our multifaceted tactics that we use to deal with voter suppression and election sabotage today in 2022. It's a multifaceted problem, so we approach it with litigation, policy advocacy, community education, and so many other tools, right? When the courts are not our direct avenue at some point for change, we have to turn to the halls of the legislature and also to community organizing. And so in the world of election protection, we're actively trying to see how we help voters access the ballot and deal with some of those barriers that Julie talked to you about when you're at the ballot box, when you have maybe an ID or you don't, maybe when you are trying to vote but you have moved from one precinct to another, or when your polling site has changed without any due notice to you, right? And so these are issues that voters face across the South and across the country, but we focus on predominantly states in the South, those states that were previously covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. New York also had covered jurisdictions under the Voting Rights Act, but for those that don't know, in 2013, we litigated a case called Shelby County v. Holder, which should be, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, so you're familiar with it, you've read the news, and you know that we're still dealing with the after effects of Shelby County v. Holder. And so without pre-clearance by the federal government, we're seeing states ram through a barrage of voter suppression laws, a barrage of laws aimed at targeting minority voters, voters at the margins, voters with differing abilities, voters that are traditionally already having a difficult time getting to the polling place and casting their ballot. And so it's really important that we work to fight these structural barriers. And how do we do that? We obviously have litigation. We had ongoing litigation in Texas for the voter ID provisions that Julie had mentioned to you. We right now are in ongoing litigation for an omnibus bill known as as SB 1 or Senate Bill 1. And so if you're not familiar with that, Senate Bill 1 is possibly the most egregious voter suppression bill in the country right now. We're seeing copycat bills across the country as well with the same language. I know that my colleagues have seen that as well. And Senate Bill 1, I really want to focus on, we're right now in litigation over Senate Bill 1, and we are focusing on its limitations to straight ticket voting, its limitations to voters being able to choose an assister of their choice to the ballot box, and also the limitations that it has posed on curbside voting. And so I'll get into each of those because I know those are, complicated terms, but we'll break it down. So let's talk first about this bill and how it impacts Texas. So there was an expanded legislative session, and we worked with our colleagues on the ground with coalition partners to try and fight the bill in its original form. We went into an extended special session and still were not able to fight Senate Bill 1. We had some problematic provisions of the bill that we were able to fight, but others not. It went into effect last year, passed in December of 2021, and this March was the first primary election with Senate Bill 1 in effect. We saw nearly 15% of vote-by-mail ballots rejected across the state of Texas. And so that's massive, right? And when you see numbers nearly 2 to 3% in years prior. Now we're approaching a general election in nearly 11 days. We're already seeing issues with curbside voting, issues with people being confused about what to do with their vote-by-mail ballots because of the now requirements to now put your social security number, last 4 digits of that, as well as other identifying information. These are barriers put in place to make it harder for voters to vote, and that is it's intentional, right? It's by no coincidence that we're seeing more and more of these laws in place that are copycat across from state to state in order to make sure that voters that are already disenfranchised are further limited to access the ballot box. And so when we have a law like SB 1 on the books, not only are we trying to fight it in the courts, but we're also working in the election protection space to make sure that folks are educated about what to do when they are going to vote. Meaning that we have a 365-day operation to educate voters about, about their rights at the ballot box, about their ability to be a nonpartisan poll monitor, which you can also do in New York with Common Cause, and about being aware about the limitations that Senate Bill 1 poses. Because let's not forget that there are possible criminal penalties and also financial fees associated with Senate Bill 1. If you're an elections worker, you can't just freely hand out or give out information about vote-by-mail ballots. You can't simply help assist voters to register to vote. And so these are commonplace things that elections workers do that now they can face criminal legal punishment for. And so what is the reason why we're really trying to punish our elections workers? Why are we, criminalizing them when they're the stewards of our democracy? It's all part of a bigger strategy, and so that's what we should all be aware of, right? We need to vote, but we also need to show up and fight these bills in the halls of our legislature. We need to call our representatives because that's how we're going to make sure that our voices are heard. You might have heard, in the various news cycles about Shay Moss, who was an elections worker in Georgia, right, who was doxxed, who was followed, who was intimidated simply for doing her job as an elections worker. So in the field of election protection, we make sure to advocate for elections workers. We are informing elections administrators of their duties, and then we're also deploying nonpartisan election monitors to make sure that we have eyes and ears on the ground to tell us what's going on at every single poll site. It's hard to do in a state like Texas, 254 counties, so many languages that are spoken, but we do our best working in coalition to make sure we have nonpartisan monitors. And then we implement rapid response measures. And so we mimic this strategy across 8 states in the South, Texas, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, and then at times also in Virginia. And so what we're doing is creating a legal and legislative record that we will use for rapid response litigation, right? We have attorneys that, like myself and others, that are ready to file, suit under the ADA or Section 11B or the KKK Act. And we're also ready to make sure that we do that direct advocacy, contacting elections administrators, letting them know you don't have signage up for curbside voting. You don't have signage up for accessibility parking. It seems simple, but these are commonplace measures to help you and I vote and to help those at the margins vote. How are voters that are in a wheelchair accessibility situation supposed to access the ballot box without a proper ramp or without a proper curb cut? It's not a solution for these poll sites to simply close or remotely locate. And so that turns me to the ADA, right? So it's really hard to bring at least we found claims under the ADA. You have to be extremely specific, and you have to really make sure that you have, obviously, proper specific facts, and then also make sure that you have solutions in place, because the solution is not to create more financial burden on the voter that needs this accessibility or to remotely relocate the polling place. And so in looking to develop those kinds of lawsuits, I'm sure my colleagues can speak about that more, we are looking to poll site data that we collect on election day. We're looking to curbside information. And so for those that don't know, curbside voting is when you can pull up to the curb and vote from either your car, or you can access a ballot, an electronic ballot. The poll worker brings it out to you. Unfortunately, in New York State, we don't have curbside voting. right? One of the many failures of New York State in terms of our voting rights access. And I'm sure that Jose is going to talk about the New York Voting Rights Act as well. So we're going to get into that. But in terms of curbside voting, we saw a lot of changes from SB1. Now, if you're a voter transporting 7 or more curbside voters and you're not related to them by family, you have to fill out an attestation. It's really difficult to know that. It's a complicated thing. So we're seeing voters that are simply just going up to the ballot box being told they have to fill out a curbside voting attestation or a transportation attestation. There's misrepresentation of the law. And so it's really confusing. So part of what we do is public education as well to elections administrators and election workers. We also reached out to the Secretary of State and the Office of the Attorney General to correct any inaccuracies in these forms. But my overall goal here is to tell you that election protection is a 365-day operation, and then we're getting ready for Election Day, where we will do direct advocacy, litigation when needed, and then we're also going to be active in the post-election process, right? Because we're in a space of election sabotage. You see it, with obviously the news reports that you're seeing in that you saw last election, Maricopa County, Wayne County, Michigan. We see it in New Mexico. These are all majority minority counties, right? So it's not a surprise to us that we're seeing saboteurs try to target these counties. We've already seen the Secretary of State and AG deploy inspectors and task force to Harris County in Texas, the most diverse county in the state, possibly the nation. And so we're getting ready to gear up and make sure that every vote is counted and every election is certified. And it's really an effort that we couldn't do without organizers, policy folks, and obviously the help of all of our collaborating civil rights organizations. So I look forward to talking more about election protection and how you all can get involved in New York and across the South.
I guess we're still afternoon. Good afternoon, not evening yet. Oh, it's light out. Jose Perez, Deputy General Counsel of LatinoJustice PRLDEF. Thank you to Teachers College for organizing this forum. This is our busy season, so I'm delighted to join this esteemed panel of voting rights colleagues, experts in the field. Thank you for allowing me to share this space with you all. As Janice mentioned earlier, I just had my 15-year anniversary at LatinoJustice. I came in fall of 2007. My first fall, what did I do? Election protection came election season. I remember I was down in Northern Virginia, Manassas County, anti-immigrant, anti-Latino movement there by some elected officials. There was a Help Save Manassas County movement, and I recall little training. We recruited volunteers in the greater DC area. We traveled down to Northern Virginia, Department of Justice allies then, we were their eyes and ears on the ground reporting, because we were expecting this. Tell me if these tactics sound familiar. Mobilization of voters, militant, paramilitary, to go to polling sites and try to intimidate voters. At that time, Manassas County, we had a growing, burgeoning Latino population, attempts to discredit or intimidate them, voter intimidation, one of the examples that I think Julie mentioned earlier. And we had to be there to monitor and observe, and actually, polling sites we were at, it was quiet. We would go someplace else, then we heard they were somewhere else. So we caught up right before the end of the day, and that's when all hell broke loose. And local police were notified, Department of Justice was notified. But in case this sounds familiar, if you've been reading news accounts about what's been happening in Arizona this week, lo and behold, it's the same. They're taking the same page out of this playbook to intimidate folks from participating in this access to the franchise. The one thing that Julie mentioned when she talked about the various issues or types of voter suppression, disenfranchisement. I work at a racial justice civil rights legal defense fund. When you talk about voter disenfranchisement suppression, who are they trying to disenfranchise or suppress? People like me, people from my community, people of color. And so it's why we need to be as vigilant and proactive. And the other thing I wanted to mention, because then my next year, 2008, was a historic presidential election, if we all can recall that far back. And I remember, and again, the key thing, we worked at that time with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which does fair elections hotline and poll site monitoring. We work with an organization called NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, which does a Ve y Vota, go and vote Spanish language hotline component. And I recall recruiting bilingual lawyers all over the city. We were, I believe, White and Case. You know, poll sites open 6 a.m. on election day. We were there at 5 a.m. and we were open the day before, and I think the weekend before, fielding calls already. And that day was so crazy. You know, and I remember I hadn't registered in advance, so I ran home like at lunchtime so I could go cast my ballot. I live on the Upper West Side, and then rushing back. By the end of the day, before the end of the day, I had lost my voice from like talking so much, yelling, screaming, answering phones. Even the phone would continue to ring at 8 o'clock. I was trying to answer. Jose Perez, can I help you? You know, because I wanted to make sure every call, that every time that phone rang, I wanted to make sure we had somebody answering a voter's question, that we could assist them. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of one of the tools that we use, and actually Asian American Legal Defense Fund and other organizations for our communities, language access. And this is another method of really disenfranchising or suppressing votes. There are provisions under the Voting Rights Act. A very popular, one of the provisions, tools in our toolkit is Section 203, which is typically triggered when there are certain localities or counties reach a population threshold that triggers local and state board of elections are providing mandatory language assistance. So there are parts here in New York City, New York State, other parts of the country to do that. I'm going to focus in on another provision, Section 4E, which is perhaps a little less well known, but one of our favorite tools are in the toolkits, and for a variety of reasons. I have a great anecdote from a lawsuit we brought in 2016 that I'm going to read to you. And we just filed a lawsuit last week against York County, Pennsylvania, on behalf of Puerto Rican residents. And in case folks don't know this yet, Puerto Ricans are United States citizens at the time of their birth, even on the island of Puerto Rico. So even if they relocate to any state here on the mainland, they are still United States citizens. And if their primary language is in Spanish and they were educated in a flag school in Spanish in Puerto Rico, they are entitled to language assistance, which could be bilingual ballots, interpreters, and so forth. We utilized this provision back in 2016, if you recall the time Hurricanes Irma and Maria devastated Puerto Rico on top of or exacerbating existing economic and financial difficulties the island was encountering. So many folks fled the island and relocated throughout the states. A particular landing spot was Florida. And throughout Florida. So on the eve, despite the number of being aware of the number of Puerto Rican residents that had relocated and were now seeking to register to vote, Florida has 62 county board of elections. Over half were refusing to provide any type of language assistance. So what did we do as lawyers? We sued. And this was on the eve of the 2018. This was back in 2018. So we filed a lawsuit for preliminary injunction mandating that they provide language assistance during early voting and then on election day. So I just want to read this brief excerpt from the judge. This is United States Chief District Judge from the Northern District of Florida, Mark Walker, who's now has been one of my favorite judges for some time. Shaking your head, right? Because he was also the judge on the SB 90 trial, where we had a momentous decision, and he recognized the historic racism and discrimination by the state of Florida, particularly targeting African American voters. But and this case was on behalf of Puerto Rican voters. So Chief Judge Mark Walker, in a decision dated September 10, 2018, quote, "Here we are again. The clock hits 6 a.m. Sonny ensures I got you, babe." Some of you, I don't know, those older in the crowd may remember that song. Sonny ensures I got you, babe starts playing. Denizens of and visitors to Puxatawny, Pennsylvania eagerly await the groundhog's prediction. And the state of Florida is alleged to violate federal laws in a handling of its elections. Quote, right? 2018, here we are, 2022. Some things, as much as we move forward, some things never change or even move backwards. And just quickly, Judge Walker then notes, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Unique among Americans, they are not educated primarily in English and do not need to be. But like all American citizens, they possess the fundamental right to vote. The issue in this case is whether Florida officials, consistent with long-standing federal law, must provide assistance to Puerto Rican voters who wish to vote. Under the plain language of the Voting Rights Act, they missed, and he granted a preliminary injunction. So again, Again, as much as I say, as much things change, sometimes things don't change. Again, we were back after the 2020 election. Florida copycatted a number of other states in passing what we call voter suppression, their law, SB 90, lawsuits, a coalition of organizations. I think there were 4 different lawsuits that were consolidated with many of our groups involved. That case went to a trial earlier this year, and the judge, in a momentous decision, granted, found in fact that discriminatory intent that I had mentioned previously and struck down the law. Unfortunately, that was only the district court. The case is on appeal now to the 11th Circuit, and we are awaiting a final determination. The 11th Circuit, not to get into judicial and partisan politics, but we're not waiting with bated breath. And as I mentioned earlier, just last week, we filed a similar lawsuit against York County in Pennsylvania. There are a significant number of Puerto Ricans that now reside in that county, 60,000 from what I recall. Again, and it's not like we like to run to court and file lawsuits. We write letters, we try to meet with election officials. Look, you have this number, you're obligated under the law. Like Judge Walker said, the law is clear. What don't you understand? To them, it's, it's dollars and cents. It's why do I care if these people vote or not, those type of responses. So we had no choice but to file a lawsuit again on an eve of another federal election. We're due back in court tomorrow. On my way here, my litigation director now texted me, good news, the county wants to settle the preliminary injunction so we don't have to go to Pennsylvania tomorrow. I hope they got that today before they hit the road, or they were on the road, or but they were ready to travel to Harrisburg, the capital, tomorrow to argue this thing. So again, it's why do we have to do this? It's the right thing. Shouldn't we be encouraging, as a democracy, and supposed one of the greatest democratic nations in the world, encouraging, making it easier for folks to register to vote, to engage in the process, to have a voice? No, we don't seem to get it. It takes lawyers like us to run to court and spend time and argue and work really hard and work late at night. But again, the other thing I wanted to talk, another point that I wanted to talk about in language access, about expanding access to the franchise. New York City, for a change, last year finally adopted a law. It was Intro 1867, now known as Local Law 11. Many of our organizations were great supporters. I know ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense, and LatinoJustice from the legal end. Again, this is something I had been involved in campaigns to try to pass this for the past over a dozen years. However, the momentum arrived last year. The city council took it up. Many of our organizations testified in support. And what this local Intro 1867, now Local Law 11, does is expands the right to vote in municipal elections to non-citizens, those who have legal permanent residency status, those who have temporary protected status, or DACA, deferred action, some type of employment authorization. It is estimated that over 800,000 to 1 million New Yorkers of immigrant background will now be able to exercise their right to vote. We're talking about individuals who pay taxes, homeowners, family, heads of household, business owners now being able to have a voice in there. This is not a novel concept. Back in the day, New York City immigrant parents could vote in school board elections in terms of determining education representatives and policies that would have impact their children in public schools. So this is a novel thing. Why did it it took such a long time, even though it seems this is the right thing to do? Much like in Florida, when they passed Amendment 4 back in 2018, in restoring the right to formerly incarcerated individuals. Again, that was a magnificent campaign, and Julie referred to this, like, again, that the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and many of our organizations, again, were advocating for this, which passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. But then the following year, notwithstanding that success, it ran into roadblocks, because, again, who are the majority of the folks that comprise that population? Huge, significant numbers of African Americans. I would also say Latinos, but we don't have the demographic data to do that, and that's a whole separate story. And Because again, Latinos, we get counted as if we're white or black, and they still haven't figured out. There's an issue called the Latino data gap, and they still haven't figured out how to count us. So we don't have the data to support that. But nonetheless, we understood that this was a severe impact or detriment to Latino individuals who had completed their sentences, had been released, and were now seeking to reintegrate. And Florida had one of the most onerous restrictive methods in terms of trying to restore your right to vote. You had a petition and had to go before the governor, who's currently running for governor again at that time, and go before a commission led by him, and he would decide whether to restore your right to vote. Makes no sense. But anyway, Local Law 11, passed overwhelmingly by the City Council this past December by operation of law. When Mayor Adams took office, he took no action, but so it became a law, went into effect, and shortly thereafter, a lawsuit was filed by the Republican Party. And I caveat, we're all nonprofits, we're all 501c3s, we're nonpartisan, we're about expanding access to the franchise. We don't tell you how to register or where to register, who to register or to vote for. But Republican Party, Republican elected officials, Republican voters filed a lawsuit. And where did they pick to file their lawsuit? Richmond County, Staten Island, of course. So again, LatinoJustice, to make sure that the City Council properly defended this law, that the Mayor's office properly defended this new law, intervened in the case along with PRLDEF and several other organizations on behalf of 9 immigrant New Yorkers who would be eligible to be able to cast their ballot in a municipal election effective next year. Unfortunately, notwithstanding best efforts, the trial judge, again, you get sometimes there's something called forum shopping. So they picked Staten Island, they drew a judge of their particular liking, and they received a decision basically granting their lawsuit, their claims, enjoining the law for now. But we live to fight another day, because in here we've appealed to what's called the appellate division. We recently filed briefs. Arguments will be held probably early next year. But again, this is the long-term strategy that, we're realists. We understand sometimes if you don't succeed in the trial court, you appeal, you hope to win on appeal. Much as we won in Florida earlier this year, we hope to prevail on appeal, but if not, then we'll seek to go up there. But so again, this expanding the access to the franchise is something that, again, that we should be encouraging, looking at, and who is it that's being disenfranchised? Who is it that's being harmed? Who is it that's being prevented? Are we not a true democracy that we all should have a voice, that we should all try to exercise that, be able to exercise that right? And again, that's what all our organizations try to do. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which again, Christina had mentioned when we talk about election protection, I mentioned earlier, again, what I had done with Ve Vota. So that Spanish language hotline exists. So for those, and there are similar ones for other languages, there are about 4 different major language hotlines that are available to all voters to call to seek assistance or information if there are any barriers or obstacles when they're trying to exercise their right to vote. So LatinoJustice in 2016 created our own initiative. We don't have a hotline because we rely on the existing hotlines, but our election protection initiative is called Cada Vota Cuenta. Every vote counts. And what we do is, again, that same MO where trying to be the eyes and ears, we try to recruit and deploy bilingual volunteers. We focus right now on 4 states, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Georgia. You'll note 3 of those states by particular choice. And we recruit and train bilingual volunteers to be at poll sites to serve as our eyes and ears. As if we're going to have to sue local and state local county and state board of elections to comply with the law, all we're asking is that they comply with the law. We're not asking them for special privileges. We're just asking them to comply with the existing law of providing language assistance. We need that information. We need that evidence. We can't be everywhere. 2020, I was in my office. I'm actually around the corner from here, but I had a team of volunteers throughout Pennsylvania. I think this election, I'm going to Georgia. You go where the action is, right? And so we will be there, and we want to ensure that there's compliance with the law. That's all we want. So again, many barriers, many obstacles, still a great need that here we are in 2022, still seems fighting some of the same battles that have been fought for the past several decades. A sad commentary on where we are as a nation. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Susana.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Envision this. There was a time where there were 90% of Black voter turnout. There was a time when 20 of the senators and other congressional leaders were Black. When was that? Right after the Reconstruction Amendments. And thank you so much for reading the 15th Amendment. That was the halcyon period when we were trying to reconstruct our democracy after the Civil War. And there was a huge backlash after all of that biracial democratic involvement and participation. There was a huge backlash. Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, so many things that gave rise ultimately, almost a full century later, after the turnout and participation was depleted and down to almost zero for Black voters, resulted in the Voting Rights Act to finally give some teeth to the 15th Amendment. We needed some sort of law that would give an enforcement mechanism to the 15th Amendment because it was just being trampled on. They were finding all sorts of ways to ensure that voters, Black voters, were not able to vote. So 1965 Voting Rights Act, Section 2, the permanent general anti-discrimination provision, says no voters' rights should be denied or abridged on account of race or former servitude. It helped a lot. There were still issues that came up. One of the original provisions was what was referred to on Puerto Ricans who were educated in American flag schools in Puerto Rico. But by 1975, 10 years later, Congress realized there were people that were language minorities, people that spoke other languages, sort of like a literacy test. They didn't have English literacy. And they weren't all Puerto Rican. Some of them were, Mexican Spanish. They weren't being covered by this section that we were discussing earlier. And there were a lot of other people who had didn't have English language abilities and were not able to vote. And they were facing some of the same problems of exclusion that prevented Black voters from being able to vote. So in 1975, 10 years later, Voting Rights Act was amended to include the language provisions. Section 2 was expanded. The general anti-discrimination was expanded so that you couldn't be discriminated against on account of race or that you're a member of a language minority. And what did those mean? Those were people they found if you were Alaskan Native, Native American, Asian, or Hispanic, not a race and ethnicity, but they covered all of the different, groups under that ethnicity that spoke Spanish. And if you are, as we discussed, if you are from a jurisdiction, a city, a county that meets a certain threshold population of citizens who are voting age and limited English proficient, and limited English proficiency means you speak English less than very well, then that jurisdiction, that city or county has to provide everything they provide in English to you, in your language, in those 4 racial groups. And that's really made a big difference. The first foray I had into voting rights was in '91. As soon as I got to the voting section of the Civil Rights Division, within about 2 weeks, I was sent back to New York City to cover the elections in Chinatown. Chinatown in New York City had just been covered under that threshold population of what they called Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, the bilingual language provisions, just been covered for Chinese. And DOJ was interested. How are they doing? And I came down and watched that they were doing terribly. So a Chinese voter would come in and would say, my name is Doe John. And they would look up John. I don't see any John here in this list of last names. Well, the reason why is because Chinese people is sort of like a custom, or like a cultural norm, say their last name first and their first name last. That's all it was. But it was a big conflict for attention in Little Italy that was not used to seeing all of these Chinese people moving into their neighborhoods. And those poll workers were not all that patient and not that kind, and would treat the Chinese, a lot of them elderly, a lot of them obviously limited English proficient, with disdain and rudeness. In fact, it even says it in the New York poll worker training manual, ask the voter their name loudly. And it was like this complete sort of culture clash where the Asian voter was coming up and saying their name sort of in a very soft-spoken manner and being asked to repeat it very loudly for these poll workers, and then turned away because their last name wasn't on the list of registered voters. They were put in segregated lines, they were called names, they weren't allowed to vote, was the bottom line. And that sort of imprinted on me the importance of this part of the Voting Rights Act. And I kind of carried that through all these years. One of the organizations I worked with at that time in making sure that New York City had an effective Chinese language election program was the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And that's where I am now. I've admired it for all of these years because they were able to show us the facts to get a fully transliterated ballot. How did they do that? Well, New York City said they couldn't possibly translate the ballot, even though they were required to. The ballots are like the most important thing you should translate. That's the thing that everybody needs to look at. And what's the most important part on the ballot? The candidate name. You know, how can they vote for the candidate of choice if they can't read the candidate name? And the name would appear in Romanized letters. And a voter who's Chinese speaking reads a Chinese newspaper and reads about their candidate in Chinese characters. And they cannot find their candidate on the ballot. To make matters worse, New York City was trying to remedy this by having a sample ballot. And they would just post it inside the booth and say, there's a sample. The voter can just look at the sample and cross-reference to the lever machine and vote their candidate of choice. Unfortunately, in New York, the ballots are rotated. The names of the candidates are rotated, so the person that appears at the top doesn't get some sort of unfair preference by voters. So the person on the top of the sample ballot did not always match the person on the top of the actual ballot. So their sample ballot really didn't work. They kept on saying, we just can't possibly fit the name of the candidate on this lever. It was like a big piece of paper that would go into their big lever machine. I don't know if any of you remember using those lever machines. It used to be that you'd have this big sort of handle, and that would cast your ballot. You go inside, you shut it, the curtain would close, and you mark all these levers off to mark your ballot. I think New York bought it from some southern state, and they used it here. And by the time I came around in '91 to look at those machines, the lever handle didn't work anymore, and the curtains were permanently clipped shut, and you kind of had to kind of find your way into the booth and back out of it. They said they couldn't fit it in, and ALDEF had a colleague who's this amazing guy, Corky Lee. I don't know if you've heard of Corky Lee. He was a photographer that has captured Asian American history, and one of the amazing pictures he took was a reenactment of a completely falsified picture of the railroad workers that all were white, which was not true. They were all Chinese, and he got the descendants of the actual Chinese railroad workers and restaged that picture and took it. And then from then on, he made sure to take pictures that captured civil rights, Asian civil rights. And it was an amazing person. And in his day job, he worked at a print shop. And in that print shop, he was able to show how you could put Chinese names on that ballot face. And so we were able to show the city of New York, look, you can put these on, and all of your reasons for not doing it are completely pretextual. And with that, we were able to get the first fully transliterated ballot in the country, and people were able to vote who they wanted to vote for. So Section 203 has a value. It allows voters who are limited English proficient to vote, and it makes a difference. In Harris County, as soon as they recovered for Vietnamese, a recent Vietnamese immigrant challenged the very powerful Senate appropriations, head of the Appropriations Committee of the state legislature, Talmadge Heflin, and won with a 33 vote lead out of over 40,000 votes cast. And it shows because they all had their ballots in Vietnamese, those Vietnamese voters were able to vote for their candidate, Hubert Vo, who's still there and has a lot of coalitional support from Blacks and Hispanics, as well as the Asians. Another Asian candidate in Bayou La Batre, Alabama, if you remember Forrest Gump, and the Vietnamese, fishing population that's growing there. A candidate that's Vietnamese was running there, and for city council, and every single one of his supporters was being challenged at the polls because they spoke Vietnamese. And the challengers said, well, if they're speaking Vietnamese, they couldn't possibly be citizens. So it was a complete race-based challenge because of their language ability. Anyways, he won once there was able to be people monitoring the polls and watching and showing that, we're watching you, don't challenge these voters. We've brought cases, with ALDEF, we brought a case on behalf of 203 in Hamtramck, Michigan, this hugely growing Bangladeshi community. And we're able to get Bangladeshi ballots after they were covered for 10 years. They still didn't want to believe that anybody needed it. And once they had it, they were able to elect the very first Muslim mayor in the country. And between the Yemeni population, Yemeni Arabic population, and the Bangladeshi population, they make up the majority of the city council there. And we also just entered into an agreement in Malden, which had been covered for 6 years for Chinese, to get them to do Chinese ballots. 203 matters, but does 203 cover everyone? Nope. In Texas, out of the 254 counties, only 3 are covered for Chinese, for Asian languages, Chinese and Vietnamese. And that leaves off 3/4 of all of the Asian LEP voters. So what do? What is the recourse for them? It's another section of the Voting Rights Act that came out in 1982, in the 1982 amendments, and it's section 208, which protects people who are illiterate, blind, or not able to read the ballot, and that means in English. So we recently filed a case there under SB1, because SB1, that was described earlier, was also limiting the rights of people to vote on be assisted by somebody that they choose, somebody that they trust, like a family member. A lot of places would prevent you to be able to bring who you want to bring in. Malika Das was one of those people. In 2015, she went into the polls in Williamson County and brought her son, who was a student at University of Texas in Austin, and he was registered in Travis County. And they would not let her get assisted by him. And we filed a lawsuit, and we were able to prevail at the district level. We even prevailed at the Fifth Circuit level and back down to the district level and got a permanent injunction that never again should they restrict assistance to people who, depending on where you're registered to vote, you should be able to assist, get your assister from wherever they're registered. And you shouldn't have your assistance limited to what happens in the booth. Texas was trying to say you could only get assistance on exactly what the ballot says. You can have an assister come in that tells you what's on the ballot, how to read it, and how to mark it, and that is it, because they were so worried about influence. We got that permanent injunction in 2018, and 3 years later, SB1 comes along and uses that exact same language that had been previously enjoined, the exact same language, except with some punctuation mark differences. And we were able to challenge that, to challenge SB1's limitation on people getting assisted by going back to that permanent injunction that all started from that one person, Malika Das. And that result now is helping us with all of our SB1 cases, all of our SB1 challenges. It's taken that Section 208, the right to your assister part, out of the picture. It's no longer something that we have to litigate. And because it's been decided, and that is now moot, and it is a protected right. And it helps not just LEP Asians, but limited English proficient people that speak a lot of other languages, and blind people and illiterate people. I'm looking forward to being able to talk about other things with all of you, but those are the areas that I think the Voting Rights Act has expanded to and has made a difference for so many people. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the work that you've done, for coming to TC and spending time with us in a very, very busy time of the year, and for all the knowledge that you've shared with us today. I had a few questions in terms of moderating, but given time, I think I'm gonna trail it back. And I'm gonna ask one question, and it's to leave it on a positive note. So on a round robin, leave us on a positive note on the state of voting rights. What can we do to stay engaged and stay enthusiastic in the process?
There we go. What people can do individually is check your voter registration today. On the subway home, on your phone, encourage other people to check their voter registration. Make sure you're all set to vote in the upcoming election. And then encourage 5 people in your family, in your building, on your block, in your community that you walk past on the street to either register or check their registration and to get out and cast their ballot. I think participation in some of the organizations that work on this topic and in your local communities is probably the most important thing to do, but at this stage, so close to an election, what you can do individually is make a plan to vote and encourage other people to make a plan to vote.
We'll just go down the line. I totally agree, and when you get your ballot, vote on the entire ballot. Don't forget to turn it over. Exactly. You've got to flip it over and vote on those little measures that seem like they don't matter, but they do. They have a big impact, and we wouldn't have the sort of strange situation of the redistricting here in New York if we had just had everybody vote on the second side of the ballot. Also, once you voted, I would ask you to ensure that the marginalized people can vote. Do some kind of volunteering to do election protection or poll monitoring with any of our organizations, and help those people that also need help to vote. We need eyes and ears. We need all of your evidence so that if it comes to some kind of a lawsuit, we've got your notes and we can do what we need to do to protect voters' rights.
Colleagues have pretty much covered it. I would just do a spin, even if you're ineligible to vote for whatever reason, non-citizen, formerly incarcerated individual whose right to vote has not been reinstated. Check with others in your family, your friend, kind of what Julie said, your circles. Identify folks, make sure that they're registered to vote and that they go out. New York is finally catching up with, like many other jurisdictions, that we finally have some type of early voting. Again, early voting starts this weekend for those, so don't wait. If you don't want to wait till Election Day, sometimes, you know, those lines can get really long. There are a number of contested elections throughout the state and the city. Take advantage of the early voting. I know during the primary season, I went to my polling site on a weekend. It was a public school. It was empty. That's not good. Again, I get it. You know, New York was kind of dysfunctional this year with 3 primary elections and different spacing because of redistricting litigation that went on. Whole nother story. You know, I encourage everyone, try to encourage folks, check your registrations and go out and exercise that right to vote and bring somebody with you.
Echoing all of those important topics, I would say, get your family involved. I'm a first-generation immigrant. My mom works 2 jobs. Make sure that they're out there and that they are going to vote. If they're in line by 9 o'clock in New York, then stay in line and go to vote. Similarly, tell your friends and neighbors that in other states, right? All of us are managing a lot, so either vote early or vote on Election Day. If you're in line, you have a right to vote. Another great way to get involved, you know, Jose mentioned that if you're not a citizen, if you have some, interactions with the criminal legal system and you've been disenfranchised, if you're not 18 yet, do election protection. You can do that work remotely. I think I provided a link to the awesome team at the Teachers College. You can join us remotely on a Zoom, help us, address issues, escalate them to attorneys when we need to do rapid response. You can help us fact gather. And so if you can't vote yet, or if you are limited through the structural barriers created in this country, election protection is a great way for you to help us. And then lastly, I would say, please don't stop getting involved after Election Day. We have major legislative sessions coming up. We have state and local elections. These are crucial, and we have a lot of ways that we can improve elections in New York and across the country. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we just helped establish the first jail-based voting polling place in Harris County, Texas, and now pretrial detainees who have a federal right to vote can vote while they're in jail and waiting for any type of sentencing, or while they're, before they're released and withheld from their right to vote. They might not even have, a credible charge against them or get sentenced. We need to bring that kind of change to New York. I want to see jail-based voting in our lifetime. So let's make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one question, and then we're going to invite Matt to come and close us out with TC Votes engagement.
In the spirit of making every vote counts, can you explain why we do redistricting at all? And in line with that, can you point to any jurisdictions that have a model system for ensuring that there isn't voter fraud, whether it's identification or whatever it takes?
I'll touch upon start with one point. Amazing, in Puerto Rico, incarcerated individuals have the right to vote and have one of the highest turnouts, that even while incarcerated, they vote. Other democratic nations, again, make it easier in terms of registering to vote, same-day voter registration, being where you're able to cast your ballot and do that. Again, I think there's a narrative that's being painted or disseminated in the media by certain individuals and certain, leave it at that, that paints us that we have this great problem, that there's voter fraud, that illegals are voting, or folks are manipulating this. That's the fraud, that this is getting reported as fact when in fact it's not happening. And so again, I think it's dispelling these false narratives and looking at some of these other countries' models that we have really, a higher voter rate. I mean, the thing what frustrates, I think, all of us is apathy, right? That we look at like how many people are registered voters and how many folks are actually coming out to vote. So what can we do to engage the community, our constituencies, to come out?
As far as redistricting, it's constitutionally mandated. Populations grow, shrink, move, change. Every 10 years after the census, states have to ensure that to respect the one person, one vote principle, that districts are equally allocated by the population. So that's mandatory. How it's done, there's a number of different ways, and I think there's been a trend towards independent redistricting commissions, and that in many ways that's been successful. So instead of the highly partisan state legislator directly drawing district maps, sometimes that's sent to a commission which is either bipartisan or nonpartisan. That's a recent trend that I think has gained some steam and enthusiasm.
The other thing I would say, like New York has a so-called independent redistricting commission, but it is not independent redistricting commission because it's controlled by the legislature and elected officials and partisan officials. So if you look at the examples, like what Julie was saying, when you talk about a true independent redistricting commission, look at the example of California, Arizona, a number of other jurisdictions where, again, those that are appointed and draw the maps have nothing, are outside the scope or purview or control of the legislature. I think we need to remove that component from the process, so then we'll have fairer maps drawn, fairer representation within, again, as we go through redistricting.
I'll just add briefly, how many lawsuits were there challenging this last election on fraud?
There are redistricting lawsuits, or? Oh, we have certainly had cases. I can think of one in North Carolina that we litigated over the course of 2.5 years, and I think there were 2 instances of fraud. over the course of discovery. And this is with the state really making an effort to turn up anything they could even possibly talk about as fraud. So there are individual voter errors, but overall we have a very safe, secure election system. And in all of these cases where a showing of fraud on the part of the state might justify restrictions, we have still been successful in opposing these laws because there is no need for a lot of the laws that suppress the right to vote. I hope people can build their confidence in election security and in our election administration, because for the most part it is very safe, very secure, and we should all have confidence in that going forward.
Okay, let's hear it for our panel. Thank you so much. My name is Matt Campen, Director of Government Relations and Community Engagement. Thank you all for being here tonight. We all have the opportunity to take action. Are you feeling inspired by our panel? All right, are you feeling inspired to leave the room and go out and make a difference? Yeah, so here's ways of doing it. You could scan the QR code on the screen or in the handout, and that will take you to action items that our panelists have already sent us. So you could register to be a poll monitor, to join Cada Voto Cuenta, or protect the right to vote with LDF, or the Asian American Exit Poll and Poll Monitoring Project. I think everyone has postcards. Does anybody need a postcard? Courtesy of the League of Women Voters of New York City. Janelle is handing those out if you want extra. When you exit the room on the way to the reception across the hall, please hand us the postcards that are going to low turnout districts throughout the city to encourage people to go out and vote. They're already stamped and ready to go. If you want more, if you need instructions on how to fill that out in a nonpartisan manner, that is also on the handout in your program. And that's about it. There's lots and lots of other ways of taking action. Thank you so much, and every vote counts, and every action that you do counts. So really appreciate what you're doing tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I just want to make sure that the QR codes can be seen by everyone here and at home on Zoom as well. I can't thank you enough for being here and for sharing really the details, the work. I think people who vote and don't have problems have no idea what is going on nationally, but also the fact that you talked about New York. I think sometimes New Yorkers think, oh, we're not Arizona, we're not Florida, we're not Texas, we're not Louisiana, and there are no problems here because I can get in and out. Oh, okay, there are long lines on the Upper West Side, but they don't really understand the extent of the difficulties and the challenges. And I don't understand why this country does not have election day mandated for everybody to be off and paid, as in other countries that take democracy seriously. But so I really wanted to thank you for this work, and as a result, we have a little something for you, because people need to know they voluntarily came here today to be with us in the midst of this system. And our executive director, Juan Carlos Reyes, has a little something for you. And Janelle, I just want to say thank you as well. And it's really important to thank Juan Carlos Reyes, who also is a law student, really put this panel together and did a tremendous amount of work to get this, to get our guests here. And I just really want to say a big thank you, and a thank you to our team. Janelle Torres is here, and Karen Hammett. We have a reception. There's a little bit of food and a little bit of wine and non-wine for those who don't, participate. And I hope people can just come and talk a little bit more with our panelists. I know, Julie, you have to head off. Yes. But I hope we see everybody. It's right across in Everett Lounge. And thank you again.